Every woman who saw his scarred hand looked away in horror. She was the only one who reached out and held it like it was something worth keeping. The candles in the servants' hall at Alderley House burned low most nights, and what little light they gave had a way of finding every seam in a poorly made dress. It found everyone in Eleanor Pryce's dress that winter. Though she had mended it so many times, the original cloth was barely more than a memory beneath the patches. She was 22. She had a needle, a thimble worn smooth at the edge, and a small wooden box of thread sorted by color, and beyond that she owned almost nothing that had not once belonged to someone else. Her days followed a pattern so fixed she could have walked it blind. She rose before the rest of the house, while the halls were still cold and dark, and lit her own small fire in the sewing-room grate, because no one troubled to light it for her. She breakfasted standing most mornings on bread and whatever the kitchen could spare, since a seamstress was not thought to require a proper place at any table, upstairs or down. She spent her mornings on whatever mending the housekeeper set before her: a torn hem, a moth-eaten shawl, a footman's livery gone thin at the knee, and her afternoons, more often than not, on the same, with perhaps an hour set aside, if she was fortunate, to walk the garden path before the light failed. In the evenings she sat again with her needle. By a single candle she was permitted, and no more, and mended until her eyes ached, because a girl who wished to remain useful learned quickly that usefulness, once questioned, was not easily restored. She had come to Alderley 5 years before, when her father died and left behind him nothing but debts no one would explain to her. He had been a country solicitor, careful with other men's papers, and careless, it seemed, with his own. And when he was gone, the house was sold, the furniture was sold, and Eleanor herself was sent to a distant cousin of her mother's, the Dowager Duchess's sister, to be useful in whatever way a poor relation could be useful. She mended, she hemmed. She sat 2 hours each evening in the small sewing room off the linen closet and turned worn things into wearable things, and she had learned, in the years since her father's death, to make herself small and quiet, because a girl who took up no room and asked for nothing was a girl no one troubled to be unkind to. She had not always thought of herself this way. There had been a year, just after her father died, when she had cried in corners and asked why, and no one in the house had answered her, because no one wished to say aloud what everyone believed, that her father's ledgers had held more shame in them than debt. She had stopped asking. She had picked up a needle instead, because a needle asked nothing of her and gave back, at the end of an hour, something whole. It was the only dignity the house allowed her, and she had come, in time, to want no other. Before all of that, before the ledgers and the debts and the cousin's cold welcome, there had been a small house in a country town, and a father who had let her sit at his desk of an evening while he worked, teaching her her letters and, later, her numbers, because he had no son to teach them to, and had never seen why a daughter should be denied what a son would have had. She remembered him best by his hands, ink-stained, careful, quick with a pen, and it had seemed to her, in the confused months after his death, a strange cruelty that a man so careful with figures should be remembered by the world as careless with them. She had asked once of an aunt who might have known the truth, whether her father had truly done what people said, and the aunt had only looked away and said that some things were better not turned over too closely, and Eleanor had understood from the look on her face, more than the words, that the aunt herself did not fully believe it either, but found it easier to let the story stand than to fight it. She had arrived at Alderley with one trunk, mostly empty, and a box of thread her father had given her for her 16th birthday, the single possession of her old life she had managed to keep entirely her own. She had told herself, on the long carriage journey north, that she would make herself useful enough that no one would think to send her further on, to some worse place, some colder welcome, and she had kept that promise to herself so faithfully that after 5 years she had very nearly forgotten there had ever been a version of her who expected anything more from a room than to be allowed to remain in it. It was said below stairs, in the careful undertone servants use for the things they are not meant to discuss, that the Duke of Alderleigh wore his right glove indoors, even at his own table, because beneath it his hand was a ruin of old scars. Gideon Ashworth was 34, unmarried, and had been untouched by scandal for 10 years, in the sense that no new scandal had come to attach itself to him. The old one had never left. A fire had taken the west wing of Alderley a decade before, and it had taken, with it, his younger brother Thomas, who had been 18 and beloved by everyone who met him. Society had decided, in the cruel shorthand of drawing rooms, that the Duke had gotten out first and left the boy behind, and the Duke had never once corrected them. His silence had been taken over the years for guilt, because a proud man's silence so often is. What no one below stairs knew, and what only the reader was permitted to understand from the very first, was that Gideon had gone back into the burning house twice. He had gone back once for Thomas, and found the stair already gone, and he had gone back again after the roof began to fall, when every man on the lawn had told him it could not be survived, because he could not make himself stand outside and only listen. The scars on his hand were not the mark of cowardice. They were the mark of a man tearing burning timber apart with his bare fingers, searching for a door that was no longer there. The true account of that night lived only in a letter Thomas had written in the weeks before he died, for he had not died in the fire itself, but some days after, of what the fire had left behind, a letter hidden somewhere in the house that would have cleared the Duke's name entirely if anyone still living had known where to look. Gideon did not speak of any of this. He wore his glove, and he ran his estate with a coldness that was not really coldness, but a man's careful management of a grief he had never been permitted to finish grieving, and he had long ago stopped expecting the world to think well of him. There had been a time, in the first year after the fire, when he had tried to explain himself. He had told his mother, before her own death some years later, exactly what had happened that night, and she had believed him, and it had made no difference at all to the wider world, because grief does not travel the way rumor travels, and a mother's belief cannot be produced in a drawing room the way a story can. After that first year, he had stopped trying. He had told himself it did not matter what strangers believed of him, so long as the estate was well run and the tenants were paid fairly, and the roof did not leak on anyone who depended on him for shelter. He had built, out of that resolve, a life that looked, from the outside, like contentment, and felt, from the inside, like a room kept very carefully in order, because it was easier than looking at what the room contained. He had thought, some years before Eleanor came to Alderleigh, that he might marry regardless, for the sake of an heir, and had gone so far as to sit through several seasons of careful introductions arranged by well-meaning relations. He had found, each time, that he could not make himself pretend an interest he did not feel, and that the women he met, seeing his glove and hearing the old story whispered behind fans, treated him with a caution that made honest conversation impossible. He had given it up in time, and had told himself that a man who had already lost the one person who loved him without condition need not go looking for a second loss of the same kind. Eleanor first crossed his path over a torn glove. It had been left carelessly across the arm of a chair in the library, the same gray glove he wore to hide his hand, and the housekeeper, not knowing what else to do with it, sent it down to the sewing room with instructions that it be mended by morning. Eleanor took it up without any particular thought and found, when she turned it over to examine the tear, that the Duke himself had come to fetch it, standing in the doorway of the small room with his bare hand held slightly behind him, as though from long habit. She looked at the hand before she looked at his face. It could not be helped. The hand was there to be measured if she was to mend the glove properly, and so she took it, gently, and turned it toward the candle to see where the stitching had failed. The scars ran from his palm to the base of his fingers, old and pale and puckered, and she did not flinch from them, and she did not look away, and she did not say the small, soft words of pity that strangers sometimes offered him, and that he had come to dread more than silence. She only said that the leather had split at the second finger, and that she would need to measure him properly if the new glove was to fit as well as the old one had. He stood very still while she worked, watching her face for the flicker of distaste he had learned to expect, and had learned, too, to brace himself against before it came. It did not come. She turned his hand this way and that in the candlelight, with the same brisk, unhurried attention she might have given a torn cuff, and when she had taken the measurements she needed, she said only, "You have been wearing this glove a size too small at the palm, Your Grace. It will have pinched you here." She touched, very lightly, the place where the old leather had worn thin, and he felt, in that light touch, something he could not at first name, because it had been so long since anyone had touched that hand without either flinching from it or making a show of not flinching, which was very often worse. "Does it trouble you?" he asked, before he had quite decided to ask it. "To see it?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "No," she said. "I have mended worse. I once turned the collar of a coat that had been half burned in a kitchen fire, and no one thought it strange that I should touch scorched cloth. I do not know why a scorched hand should trouble me more than scorched cloth, unless it is only that people expect it to." He said nothing for a long moment, and she thought perhaps she had spoken too plainly, in the way she sometimes forgot herself, and spoke too plainly to those above her, and began to apologize. But he stopped her with a small motion of the very hand she had been examining. "Do not apologize," he said. "It is the first true thing anyone has said to me about that hand in 10 years. She did not know then all that lay behind those words, but she understood enough of the weight in them to keep silent, rather than press him for more. And it was that silence, the not pressing, the leaving of a wound alone until its owner chose to speak of it, that he would remember afterward as the true beginning of everything that followed. Gideon, who had built 10 years of solitude on other people's recoiling, found in her plainness something he had not felt in a long while, and it took him some days to recognize it as mercy. He did not speak of it to anyone. He began instead, without quite admitting to himself that he had begun, to notice her, from the gallery above the hall during her fittings with his aunt, from the study window when she crossed the garden with a basket of mending, from the head of his own table when she came in, once a week, to see to the household linens. He noticed the quiet way she endured the small humiliations of her position. A curt word from the housekeeper, a task given at an hour meant to inconvenience her, the particular unkindness of being spoken over as though she were not in the room, without ever once seeking pity for any of it. He found himself, against every rule he had made for his own conduct, wanting to know more of her than her stitching. The chief architect of Eleanor's humiliations, and in time the chief obstacle to whatever was growing quietly between the seamstress and the Duke, was a woman named Constance Whitlow, a distant cousin by marriage who had installed herself some years before as companion to the Dowager, and had made herself, through long patience and longer scheming, nearly impossible to remove. Mrs. Whitlow had a son, Julian, plain and ambitious and utterly dependent on his mother's schemes for whatever future he hoped to have, and she had set her whole mind for 3 years now on arranging some match or connection that would tie her son's fortunes to the dukedom. She saw in Eleanor's growing favor with Gideon a threat to be extinguished, and she set about extinguishing it with the only weapons a woman in her position had: rumor, small cruelty dressed up as concern, and patience. It would have been easy to call Mrs. Whitlow simply wicked, and many in the house did call her so, but her malice was not without its own wound. She had clawed her way up from a poverty not unlike Eleanor's own, and something in her could not forgive the girl the softness she herself had been forced to abandon long ago, in rooms much like the sewing room, with a mother who had taught her that kindness was a luxury poor women could not afford. She told herself, when she was unkind to Eleanor, that she was only teaching the girl what the world would teach her anyway, and sooner. It did not make her kinder. It only made her, in the small, dark hours when she could not sleep, a little sadder than she let anyone see. For a long while her cruelties were small. She gave Eleanor the coldest room to work in. She let it be known, in careful phrases, that a girl in Eleanor's position ought not to be seen speaking with the Duke, however briefly, on any pretext. She watched, and waited, and grew more afraid as the weeks went on, because she saw what Eleanor herself had not yet let herself see, that the Duke's eyes followed the seamstress across a room in a way they followed no one else. Eleanor, for her part, told herself for a long time that she imagined it. A Duke did not look twice at a girl who mended his linens. She kept her eyes on her work and her voice low and her requests, when she had any, brief, because she had learned that a woman in her position who asked for nothing was a woman no one troubled to refuse. But there were evenings, crossing the garden with the last of the day's light going gold across the hedges, when she felt a warmth in being watched that she did not examine too closely, for fear of what she might find if she did. There was, that spring, a particular evening she would remember long after, when she had been sent up to the long gallery to see to a set of curtains that hung there, unused, over windows no one troubled to open. She had climbed the ladder herself, since no footman had been sent to help her, and had been standing on the topmost rung, arms stretched high to unhook the fabric, when she became aware, quite suddenly, of being watched from the doorway. She turned, expecting the housekeeper come to hurry her along, and found instead the Duke himself, standing very still, his expression unreadable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Forgive me," he said at last. I did not mean to startle you at such a height." "You did not startle me, Your Grace," she said, climbing down with the careful economy of a woman used to ladders. "I have been climbing since I was a girl. My father kept a very tall bookshelf and no footman at all, and I learned early that if I wanted the top shelf, I should have to fetch it myself." He had smiled at that, a small thing, barely a movement of the mouth, but she had seen it, and it had struck her that she had never once seen him smile in the 5 years she had lived under his roof. She wondered, walking back down the gallery with the curtains folded over her arm, what it might take to see it again. He, for his part, had come to the gallery on no real errand at all. He had seen her cross the lawn from his study window an hour before, and had found himself, without quite deciding to, following the direction she had gone, telling himself he meant only to see that the old curtains were removed as he had instructed. He stood a long while afterward at the gallery window, watching the space where she had stood on the ladder, and thought, with something between alarm and a feeling he had not permitted himself in a decade, that he had begun to arrange his days, in small and unacknowledged ways, around the hope of seeing her cross a room. Mrs. Whitlow's cruelties, meanwhile, grew sharper as her fear grew sharper. She had begun, that spring, to keep a kind of private ledger of her own, not figures, but observations, small notes on where Eleanor had been seen, and with whom, gathered in the hope that some pattern might yet emerge that she could use. She told herself she gathered this information only for the good of the household, to protect the dowager from an entanglement that could bring nothing but scandal upon the family name. But she knew, in the honest hours before dawn when sleep would not come, that what she truly feared was much smaller and much more selfish than any concern for the family's honor. She feared what would become of her own position and her son's prospects if a penniless seamstress rose to a place Mrs. Whitlow herself had spent years securing for someone else. She began, that season, to write more frequently to her cousin in town, a woman with connections among the old solicitor's clerks who still remembered the scandal of Eleanor's father, and she waited, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that ruin, properly timed, does more damage than ruin delivered in haste. Neither Eleanor nor Gideon knew, that spring, how closely they were being watched, nor by whom, nor why. Eleanor thought only that Mrs. Whitlow disliked her, as she had always disliked her, and thought no further on it. Gideon, for his part, was too occupied with his own new and unfamiliar feeling to notice that his aunt's companion had taken to appearing with unusual frequency in whatever room he had lately left. It was only afterward, once the whole of it had come to light, that either of them understood how long the ground beneath their feet had already been shifting, unseen, while they themselves had been looking only at each other. It was Gideon who broke the silence between them first, on an evening in early spring when he found her alone in the garden, sitting on the low stone wall with a basket of mending untouched beside her, watching the light go down. He came without meaning to disturb her and stayed without meaning to stay, and they spoke that evening of nothing of consequence, the weather, the garden, a book she had once owned and lost with everything else her father left behind. But he watched her face as she spoke of her father, and he saw something there he recognized, because he wore it himself. The particular stillness of a person who has learned to speak of loss without letting it show. "You do not ask me about my hand," he said at last when the light was nearly gone. "You have not asked me about my father," she answered, "and I have found people kinder, on the whole, for not asking." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Lo, there is more to the story of that hand than the house believes." "I had thought there might be," she said. "You do not wear a glove for a wound you are ashamed of. You wear it for a wound you have stopped explaining." He looked at her a long while after that and said nothing more, and she did not ask him to. It was, though neither of them named it so, the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find again in a life each had already resigned to solitude. Over the weeks that followed, he found reasons to be near her that he did not examine too closely, and she found reasons to linger in rooms she might otherwise have left, and Mrs. Whitlow, watching from her window and her doorway and her careful position at the dowager's elbow, grew more afraid with every week that passed. She began, in small ways, to press. She told the housekeeper that Eleanor's work had grown careless, though it had not. She told the dowager, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that it was a pity a girl in Eleanor's position did not know her place better. She wrote, once, a letter to a cousin in town, asking after the particulars of a certain solicitor named Pryce who had died some years before in disgrace, because she suspected, rightly, though she did not yet know how rightly, that the girl's history held something she might yet use. Eleanor bore all of it the way she bore everything, with her eyes down and her hands busy, and told herself it did not matter, because a needle asked nothing of her and gave back, at the end of an hour, something whole. But she began, that spring, to want more than a needle could give her, and she did not know what to do with the wanting. The first real test of what was growing between them came on an evening in April, when the Duke held a small dinner for a handful of neighboring families, the kind of evening at which a seamstress had no business appearing except to see that the table linens were properly laid. Eleanor had come down early to check the hems of a set of new curtains in the small parlor off the dining room, not meaning to be seen at all, and was still there, kneeling with a mouthful of pins when Gideon came through unexpectedly to fetch a letter he had left on the mantel. He stopped in the doorway. She rose, pins still in hand, and made to leave, and he said quietly, "Stay a moment." And she stayed, though every rule of the house said she ought not to. "I have wondered," he said, "whether you find it hard, living as you live here." She considered lying to him, as she had learned to lie to everyone who asked her that question, with some soft answer about being grateful for a roof and a place. But something in his face, some old tiredness that matched her own, made her answer honestly instead. "I find it hard some days," she said. "I have found, since my father died, that the world does not trouble itself much over what a poor woman finds hard. So I have stopped saying it aloud, on the whole. It changes nothing, and it costs something to say." "It costs me nothing to hear it," he said. "I would rather you said it to me than said nothing at all." She looked at him a long moment, and something in her chest, some old guarded room, opened a very small crack, and she said, "Then I will tell you sometimes when it is hard." And he said, "I would be glad of it." And that was all that passed between them that evening. But it was enough that when Mrs. Whitlow came upon Eleanor in the corridor some minutes later, flushed and pin-fingered, she knew at once that something had shifted, and she went to her own room that night and sat a long while with her hands folded, and began in earnest to plan. It was some weeks after this that matters came to their first real crisis. Mrs. Whitlow had discovered, through her cousin in town, a piece of correspondence suggesting that Eleanor's father had died not merely in debt, but under some cloud of dishonesty, a claim the reader was given reason to doubt from the first, for it had been supplied by a source with every interest in the falsehood, though Eleanor herself did not yet know this. Mrs. Whitlow brought this rumor to the dowager in careful, sorrowful tones, expressing only her concern for the household's good name, and the dowager, troubled, brought it in turn to Gideon. He did not believe it. He told his aunt plainly that he did not believe it, and that he would not have Eleanor spoken of in such terms under his own roof on the strength of an unsigned letter from a woman with a grudge against her. But the rumor once loosed could not be entirely called back, and it reached in time the ears of the household staff, who were not always kind to one another, and Eleanor found herself, within the week, made to feel the full weight of a suspicion she could not answer because she did not know its source. Worse followed. A small brooch belonging to the dowager went missing from her dressing table, and Mrs. Whitlow, with an expression of great reluctance, suggested that perhaps a search should be made of the servants' rooms, beginning, she thought it only fair to say, with the room of the girl whose own father's honesty had lately come into question. It was a cruelty dressed so carefully as concern that the dowager herself did not see it for what it was, and a search was ordered, and the brooch was found, for Mrs. Whitlow had placed it there herself, in a moment of fear and desperation that she would later be unable to fully explain even to herself, folded into a stocking at the bottom of Eleanor's small trunk. Eleanor was brought before the assembled household the next morning in the hall, with the dowager standing pale and uncertain, and Mrs. Whitlow at her elbow murmuring that she was so very sorry it had come to this, and threatened with dismissal and, worse, with the ruin that followed a woman accused of theft wherever she went afterward. Eleanor did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not explain herself past the plain, quiet statement that she had not taken the brooch and did not know how it had come to be where it was found. She had learned over 5 years of small humiliations that a woman in her position gained nothing by pleading, and so she stood, straight-backed, and said only what was true, and waited to be believed or not believed. "It was found among your things, child," the dowager said, not unkindly, but with the helplessness of a woman who did not know how else the matter could be read. "How else are we to understand it?" "I cannot say how it came to be there, your grace," Eleanor answered. "I can say only that I did not put it there, and that I have mended this household's linens for 5 years without once taking so much as a spare button that was not given me. I have little enough of my own. I have never wanted what belongs to someone else." "A pretty speech," Mrs. Whitlow said, in a voice of great sorrow that did not reach her eyes. "But a pretty speech is not evidence, and the brooch was found where it was found." She turned to the dowager. "I take no pleasure in this, cousin, I assure you, but we cannot have it said that Alderleigh keeps a thief under its roof and does nothing." The housemaids standing at the edge of the hall exchanged looks Eleanor could read well enough. Not unkindness, most of them, but the particular fear of servants who know that a suspicion, once raised against one of their number, might easily be raised against any of them next, and who therefore find it safer to look away than to speak in another's defense. Only one girl, young Bess, who had scrubbed grates alongside Eleanor her first winter at Alderleigh, opened her mouth as if to say something, and then, catching Mrs. Whitlow's eye, closed it again and looked at the floor. Eleanor did not blame her for it. She understood, better than anyone in that hall, what it cost a poor woman to speak up in defense of another poor woman when the ones with power stood ready to punish the wrong word. It was into this silence, thick with the particular cowardice fear breeds in an unequal house, that Gideon came down the stairs. It was then that Gideon came down the stairs. He had heard from a footman sent running what was happening in the hall, and he came down without his glove, his scarred hand bare for all the household to see, and stood beside Eleanor rather than beside his aunt, and said, in a voice that did not rise but that carried to every corner of the hall, that he had watched Miss Pryce closely enough these past months to know her character beyond any reasonable doubt, and that he would not have her accused on the word of a missing brooch and an unsigned letter. He said that he would have the matter properly investigated, by a magistrate if necessary, before any further word was said against her under his roof. It was the first time in 10 years he had stood before his own household without his glove, without hiding the hand the world had decided marked him a coward, and he did it for her in front of everyone who had ever whispered about that hand, because he had decided, in that moment, that her good name mattered to him more than his own comfort ever had. Mrs. Whitlow, watching from the edge of the hall, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and understood with a cold clarity that she had very little time left to finish what she had begun. The true unraveling came some days later, and it came, as such things sometimes do, from an unlikely direction. Eleanor had been set the task of sorting through a great cedar chest of old mending sent up from the nursery, small coats and gowns, decades old, that some earlier housekeeper had put by against some future need that had never come. Among them was a child's coat, dark green, the wool gone thin at the elbows, and as Eleanor turned it over to examine a loose seam at the lining, her needle caught on something folded flat and hard beneath the cloth. She unpicked the lining carefully, the way she unpicked everything, with patience and without haste, and found inside it a letter, yellowed and creased from years of folding, in a young man's hand. It was signed Thomas, and it was addressed, in its opening lines, to whoever might one day find it, in case anything should happen to him, before he could say the words aloud himself. She read it there, kneeling by the cedar chest, and understood, before she had finished the first page, what she held. Thomas had written it in the days after the fire, before the fever that had followed his burns took him at last, and in it he set down plainly, in a boy's careful hand, that his brother had gone back into the burning house twice to find him, that Gideon had torn at the burning timber with his bare hands searching for a door already lost, and that whatever the world came to believe of that night, his brother had done everything a man could do, and more than any man ought to have been asked to do. He had meant to say it himself, once he was well again. He had not lived long enough to say it. Eleanor brought the letter to Gideon that same evening, her hands not quite steady, and watched him read it in the lamplight of his study, watched his face as he came to his brother's words, and saw, for the first time since she had known him, the composure he wore like armor come apart entirely. He did not weep long, and he did not weep in front of her past the first moment, but he held the letter a long while after, and said at last, in a voice she had never heard from him before, that he had carried 10 years of the world's judgment because he had never been able to prove it wrong, and that she had found, in an afternoon's mending, the one thing that could clear his name that he himself had searched for and never found. "I searched that house for a fortnight after he died," Gideon said, turning the letter over in his hands as though it might vanish if he looked away from it. "I searched his desk, his room, the ruins of the West Wing itself, though there was little enough left to search by then. I told myself after a time that if there had ever been such a letter, the fire had taken it along with everything else, and that I would simply have to live the rest of my life inside a story that was not true, because the true one had burned with him." "He did not want you to have to," Eleanor said quietly. "See how carefully he hid it. Not burned, not lost, sewn into a lining in a coat put away with particular care. He meant it to be found, Your Grace. He simply could not have known it would take 10 years, or that it would take a stranger's needle to find it." "You are not a stranger," he said, looking up at her at last. "You have not been a stranger to this house in a long while, whatever the world outside it believes of your place here." She did not answer that at once, because she did not trust her own voice to answer it steadily, and he seemed to understand this, for he said nothing further, only sat with the letter in his scarred hand and let the silence between them do the work that words just then could not. "What will you do with it?" she asked at last. "I will not hide it away a second time," he said. "My brother did not write 10 years' worth of silence for me to keep. I mean to have it read plainly before whoever will listen, and let the truth do what the truth ought to have been permitted to do a decade ago." The letter's discovery could not be kept quiet, nor did Gideon wish it kept quiet. He had it read before the assembled household, and later before the small circle of neighboring families who had, for 10 years, believed the worst of him, and the truth of that night was restored to him entirely, in his brother's own hand, beyond any further whisper's power to undo. But the letter did more than restore the Duke's name. In the course of establishing where the coat had come from and why it had been put away with such particular care, it came out that the coat had belonged to Thomas, and had been packed away by the old housekeeper at the express instruction of a distant relation managing the estate's affairs in the confusion after the fire. A relation who had also, it emerged upon careful examination of old papers that the matter now made necessary, had a hand in the finances of a certain country solicitor some years before. Constance Whitlow's late husband, it was found, had falsified the debts that ruined Eleanor's father, taking for himself what little the Pryce family had held, and leaving a good man's name in ruin so that no one would look too closely at where the money had gone. Mrs. Whitlow had known of it, or at least had long suspected it, and her fear of its coming to light, more than any hope for her son's fortunes, had driven half her cruelty toward Eleanor from the very first. She did not deny it when it was laid before her. She sat very still in the dowager's morning room, and said only that she had done what she believed necessary to secure her son's future, in a world that had never once secured hers, and that she did not expect forgiveness and would not ask for it. She was not destroyed in the end, for cruelty is not answered with cruelty in a well-run house, but she was quietly removed from her place and given a small cottage at the edge of the estate's lands, enough to live on modestly and no more. And her son went with her, his own ambitions for the dukedom's influence at an end. She lived out her years there in a kind of chastened quiet, and it was said, though not often, that she took in mending herself in her last years, and grew, in her own small way, gentler than she had ever managed to be as a woman with more to lose. For Eleanor, the letter's discovery meant something else besides justice for a man she had come to love. It meant that her father's name, too, could at last be cleared, that the shame she had carried for 5 years as though it were her own had never belonged to her at all, and that she could stand, for the first time since she was 17, without the particular weight of a disgrace she had not earned. Gideon came to her in the garden again, some evenings later, when the roses were beginning to come on, and the light went down gold across the hedges as it had that first evening between them. He did not wear his glove. He had not worn it, she realized, in some days. "I have spent 10 years, he said, believing that the world's good opinion was a thing I had lost beyond recovering, and that I would spend my life alone rather than watch it withheld from someone I loved as it had been withheld from me. You have given me back more than my name. You gave me back mine first," she said. The day you stood beside me in that hall instead of beside your own comfort. I did not do it for your name alone, he said. I want to be plain with you, though I am not always a plain-spoken man. I have watched you 5 years in this house, doing work no one thanked you for, bearing unkindness no one troubled to notice, and in all that time I never once saw you make yourself smaller than you needed to be to survive it. I have envied you that, if a duke may be permitted to envy a seamstress, I have not managed in 10 years what you managed every day without seeming to try. I did not manage it without trying, she said. I only learned early not to let it show. It is not so very different, I think, from a man who has learned not to let a scar show, except that mine could be hidden with silence, and yours could not be hidden at all, whatever the glove pretended. She paused and added more quietly, I used to think it was a kind of strength, the not letting it show. I'm not certain any longer that it was strength at all, so much as fear dressed up to look like strength, because I did not think anyone in this house would trouble themselves to help me carry it otherwise. He laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself were a thing he had half forgotten how to produce, and said, You have always seen more plainly than anyone else in this house, Miss Pryce. I find I no longer wish to be seen by anyone else. Then you had better say what you mean to say, she said, before one of us loses courage. He took her bare hand in his bare hand then, scarred palm against work-worn fingers, and neither of them looked away. And he asked her, in the plain, quiet way he did everything that mattered to him, whether she would consent to be his wife. He told her he had little enough left to offer that the world would call remarkable, a title she had never once seemed to want, a hand the world had called ruined, and 10 years of solitude he did not know entirely how to set down. But he told her, too, that he had not laughed without effort in a decade until that evening, and that he did not wish to spend whatever years remained to him learning that particular lesson alone. She did not answer at once, not because she doubted her own heart, but because she wanted, for once in her life, to let a good thing arrive slowly enough to be fully felt before it passed. Then she said, in the same plain way he had asked her, that she would. They were married that autumn, quietly, in the small chapel at Alderleigh, with the household staff permitted to stand at the back, because Eleanor had asked that they be there, having stood among them herself not so very long before. The dowager wept, and said it was the first wedding at Alderleigh in 20 years that had not been arranged for anyone's convenience but the 2 people standing at the altar, and she meant it as the highest praise she knew how to give. Young Bess, the housemaid who had once looked away rather than speak in Eleanor's defense, stood at the very back of the chapel that day with tears on her own face, and came to Eleanor afterward in the confusion of well-wishers to say she was sorry she had not spoken up when it mattered, and Eleanor took her hands and told her there was nothing to forgive, that she understood better than anyone what it cost a poor woman to speak against power, and that she hoped, now that she herself stood a little nearer that power, to make it cost less for the next girl who found herself in Bess's place. It was not an empty promise. Within the year, Eleanor had seen to it that no servant at Alderleigh could be dismissed on a single unproven accusation again, whatever her own station, without the matter first coming before the Duke and Duchess themselves. Eleanor did not give up her needle, married life or no. She took in time to teaching 2 of the younger housemaids to sew properly, sitting with them in the same small room off the linen closet where she had once sat alone, and it was said among the staff, fondly, that the Duchess kept the coldest hours in the house by choice, because she had never quite lost her liking for an early fire and a quiet room before the rest of the household stirred. In the years that followed, visitors to Alderleigh sometimes noticed small things they could not quite account for. They noticed that the Duke no longer wore his glove at dinner, his scarred hand resting openly on the table beside his wife's, as though it had never been a thing to hide at all. They noticed that the Duchess still kept a small box of thread by her chair in the evenings, sorted by color, though she had long since had no need to mend anything for wages, and that she still took a particular pleasure in turning a worn thing into a whole one, because it was, she said, the one skill she would not have traded for any rank the world might have offered her instead. And they noticed, if they looked closely enough, framed above the hearth in the nursery, a small embroidered handkerchief, plain linen once, transformed thread by golden thread into something delicate and fine. The same handkerchief Eleanor had stitched the week they married, kept now where their own children would grow up seeing it, a reminder, though the children were too young yet to understand it, that the smallest and quietest hands in a house are sometimes the ones that hold it together. Gideon told the story to his son himself years later, on an evening much like the one in which he had first asked for Eleanor's hand. The light going down gold across the hedges, the roses full and heavy on the walls. He told him of a fire, and a brother, and a letter hidden in a lining no one thought to look at, and a woman who had come to a great house with nothing but a needle and had used it, in the end, to mend more than cloth. He did not tell it as a lesson, though his son would take it as one anyway, the way children often do. He told it simply because it was true, and because a thing that has been hidden too long, once it is finally spoken aloud, deserves to be spoken often, so that no fire and no falsehood may ever bury it again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.